You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 10th of September 2024 on Monocle Radio.
Israel and its antagonists warm up ahead of the UN General Assembly. Donald Trump prepares to face his second debate opponent of this election, and the latest trends in bunker design and decoration. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Yossi Meckelberg and Patricia Cohen will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from the artistic director of the imminent Vienna Contemporary Art Fair. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Yossi Meckelberg, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House, and Patricia Cohen, Global Economics Correspondent for the New York Times. Hello to you both.
Hello there.
Neither of you, it transpired in the waiting room, have been anywhere or done anything especially riveting lately, which is unlike both of you, as regular listeners will be aware. Instead, you've been sitting at home like ordinary people watching television. Patricia, what have you been watching?
So I just started a new series, which I'm very interested in, called A Gentleman in Moscow, which is based on a book that I loved. And so it's takes place right after the revolution in Russia in the 1920s. So that's been good. And of course, the Rings of Power, you know, the Lord of the Rings.
You say of course, like this is something that people would watch without some sort of gun being held to their head.
You are clearly not the TV binge watcher that I am. So it's really on most binge watch lists.
Are you a fan of the sort of Lord of the Rings oeuvre generally?
Yes.
Okay.
But going back to for when I was a kid.
Yes, because the thing is, I did that when I was a kid. I think I asked for Tolkien's book, Lord of the Rings, as a Christmas present when I was like 13 or 14 or something, because that's what 13 or 14-year-old boys do. And one of the few bits of absolutely clear-headed adolescent thinking of which I remain proud was that I think I got about 50 pages into it, and even at the age of 13 and 14 decided, you know what, life just is too short.
Well, I am trying to channel my 13-year-old boy, so, you know.
Oh, the poor kid. Yossi, have you been watching things while you prepare for your next trip, which you will tell us about when you're back?
Yeah, and I promise to start traveling just to make sure that I have something interesting to tell you.
Please.
Next time. We were watching Cleo, which is a sort of Killing Eve in German.
Well, there's a quote for the posters.
Yeah, it's very similar. It's all the idea of, you know, some sort of thriller, end of Cold War, all this shadowy world of CIA, Stasi, post-Stasi, and all of them trying to find, of course, you see it's one big fantasy that can happen, but the Germans take it, even believe it or not, further than Killing Eve, because it between the sort of East Germans discover drugs and psychedelic music and trying to get rid of communism at the same time, and they not always see the difference between the two. It makes actually great watching, especially.
I'm adding it to my list.
No,
right now.
I think it's good.
That combination of East Germans, drugs, and psychedelic music has got me intrigued. The title again, Yossi?
Cleo, named
Cleo.
after the star of this, Cleo.
Okay.
She's the one. She does some things that you can't believe while when you're trained by the Stasi with early age.
One to bear in mind. But we will start at the United Nations in New York City, where the 79th UN General Assembly kicks off today. There will be an amount of preparatory ceremony and general throat clearing before the furniture starts flying properly in a couple of weeks, and probably the most anticipated intervention this year will be a draft resolution which Palestine is punting. This would call for Israel to withdraw from the West Bank within 6 months, and by way of preemptive retort, Israel's Foreign Minister Israel Israel Katz has threatened to, quote, break and dissolve the Palestinian Authority. So not a huge amount of appetite for compromise there, Yossi. UN General Assembly resolutions, to be clear, are not legally binding, and Israel has been on the receiving end of many in the past. But would this be a big deal if a majority of the 193 members of the UN put their hands up and say Israel in Judea and Samaria should pack up and push off?
Of course, we won't put a bet of this happening anytime soon.
No.
However, I think there is an accumulated impact of what's happening. And this, if the General Assembly eventually actually vote, and I assume they would vote in favor of it, it's following a decision, an advisory opinion by the ICJ. Mm-hmm. And this is a thing. First, the General Assembly asked the ICJ for their advisory opinion about the legality of the occupation. Now, not exactly shocking to anyone that the ICJ came and said, no, it's illegal. Good. And the other thing is the way that Israel conducts the occupation is unlawful. And as when it comes, for instance, the way it treats the local population, the Palestinians, the way it builds settlements, grabs land, and, all the series of things. But the interesting thing is that it has to end and end immediately. What also the ICJ said, that Israel, you can't actually, don't intervene in that because interfere with negotiations, which is, of course, laughable. Because when the last time you heard about peace negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians? So they try to sideline that. And whether it has the right at all to have any advisory opinion, then the ICJ said, yes, because the General Assembly asked us to have an opinion about that, and we provide. And it's a very detailed. So, we saw that the General Assembly already, again, a few months ago, reiterated recognition of a Palestinian state, though again, it's not binding because you need a Security Council. The way that Israel conducts the war, the kind of the condemnation, the ongoing or the gradual isolation, also the changes here in the UK, we see when it came to the licenses to supply weapons to them. So I think there is there. But at the end of the day, you need someone within the international community, even more importantly, forces within Israel, but also among the Palestinians that really believe in change and a positive change, because we are approaching a year since this horrible, horrible war broke out, and where does it lead both people?
Well, it's going to be, Patricia, a lively couple of weeks for the Israeli delegation at the UN. There is also going to be an amount of pressure from the United States. We've heard from Anthony Blinken today calling unprovoked and unjustified the shooting on the West Bank of a US-Turkish citizen, Aysenur Ezgiaygi. The UN is also demanding a full investigation into that. But when pressure is coming from the United States in particular, which has grown steadily less patient with Israel since last October 7th, does that become more meaningful?
Well, first of all, the context now is, we're right, very close to the presidential election, which we will talk about later. And so everything is, from the U.S. perspective, kind of a sideshow to that. And any positions that it's the government is taking on Israel and the Middle East are, with two eyes cocked to how is this going to play among the electorate and in the states where it's important and voters. And it's really, in terms of the U.S. position at this point, I think, as much as there is a desperate desire to try and do something to kind of bring some sort of ceasefire around, that it's domestic politics in the U.S. that are really holding sway. As for Israel, it seems that the government has proved to be very impermeable in a way to criticism and is going on its own, to me, crazy course. And what people from the outside are saying is really not having much of an impact. I think the only impact would really be if the U.S. were to actually halt military aid and arms sales. I don't see that happening in the near future.
Or at least certainly nobody's likely to suggest that while they're running for president. Yossi, you mentioned the fact that the first anniversary of October 7th is not far away. Does that loom as an additional pressure point for Benjamin Netanyahu? We saw obviously quite recently those huge protests, even by recent standards, after 6 hostages were murdered by Hamas. A lot of Israelis think that those 6 hostages and indeed others should have been brought home long before now. Will the anniversary of October 7th lead to renewed questioning in Israel along the lines of, I guess, those questions Patricia was just asking, like what actually are we doing and how do we expect this to end?
No doubt they should. Because for months, Netanyahu said, yes, in Hebrew, the word Pesa, which means, in a biblical way, we are one step from a total victory. And you would expect it to happen every minute if you are one step ahead for many months. And obviously, there is no total victory. And the hostages are still in the tunnels held by Hamas. And instead of life hostages, we're getting back more and more bodies. It's not to exonerate Hamas for the killing of hostages. But there was since May, there is a deal on the table. And Netanyahu keep adding demands. So, comes October 7, and people will ask, what happened a year earlier when this, the entire border with Gaza was not protected? More than 1,200 people were killed within a day. Hostages went there. Still more than 100 are held by Hamas. And I think for months we've seen public opinion polls that most Israelis said, it's more important to bring the hostages back, that the so-called total victory. And now it came an issue that we haven't heard about it until a month ago about the Philadelphia. We know the Philadelphia corridor. But
this is the border between Gaza and Egypt.
So all of a sudden, this has become not the hill to die for, but the corridor to die for. That if you can't stay there, there is no deal. Now, hence why you see an interesting coalition of protesters. Because if you go back before October 7, those are the more progressive liberal that try to defend the democratic system in Israel and the independence of the judiciary. Now you have other people, even including people that voted for Netanyahu, are in the streets because the way that the hostages are abandoned. And it will be interesting as now that there is a documentary coming in the film festival in Toronto, the Bibi Files. This might add to this as well because this is footage from the investigation. So again, sometimes, it seems that it goes very slow, but there is an accumulated impact. But I think from the protesters' point of view, it's not having a protest here and there. It's just the continuity in there, I think, can an impact. But just go back for a second to what Israel Katz said about this. Here is what they learned from October 7. All the idea of supporting Hamas, allowing all this money to go to Gaza, is the divide and rule between the PA, the Fatah, and Hamas, and that's ended in a disaster. What's the conclusion of the foreign minister? We have to weaken the Fatah even more because this worked so well in the past.
Just before we move off this subject, Patricia, there are also suggestions ahead of the UN General Assembly that Iran wants to reopen talks about the moribund nuclear deal. Is that a strange stroke being pulled by Tehran there, given that they won't be entirely sure yet which US administration they will be dealing with?
Well, I think that they see a possible point of leverage, particularly in the desire of the U.S. and the rest of the world in order to contain the violence from spreading further in the Middle East. And Iran obviously has a role that it can play in that. I mean, it is interesting. We were talking about domestic politics in the U.S., there's domestic politics going on in Iran, and it was making me think when you were talking about in Israel too, because a lot of people would argue that a lot of what Netanyahu's doing has nothing to do with the security of Israel and everything to keeping himself in office and keeping himself out of jail. So, you've got these international geopolitical currents, but also all of these domestic currents going on as well.
Well, to the United States now, where the presidential election remains bemusingly close as voters struggle to decide between a qualified, apparently competent and broadly sane former state attorney general and US senator and a career con man and convicted criminal who has attempted to overthrow the constitutional order once already. The choice in November will come down to the whim of 7 swing states, one of which is Pennsylvania, a fact of electoral life which has worked out badly for Nippon Steel, whose proposed $15 billion takeover of Pittsburgh-based US Steel appears scuppered. Patricia, the alleged reason why President Biden has spiked this is national security concerns about a Japanese
that's crazy
company.
That is just laughable on the face of it. I mean, and it's funny because I had actually very recently been working on a story about Japan's industrial policy, and it caused me to go back and look at a time when tensions were actually quite high between Japan and the United States.
This was a thing.
Yes, in the 1980s and 1990s. It's the Asian economic superpower that everybody was terrified of in the 1980s and the early 1990s was not China but Japan. And I was reading a book by Michael Crichton that had been made into a movie, Rising Sun, that was considered very Japan bashing at the time about the fear of the superpower. And in fact, surveys in 1980 of the American public, twice as many Americans said that they were more fearful as a national security threat of Japanese economic power than at that time the Soviet military. So that gives you a sense of where it is. Today, though, it makes absolutely no sense at all. And if you think of the broader foreign policy of the United States, which is to increase trade and investment among its allies, the horrible phrase friendshoring that we've heard, in order to make supply chains more resilient and secure, with an eye towards China in this case. So therefore, prohibiting a foreign direct investment sale from what's considered one of your closest allies doesn't make sense. Aside from the fact that the reason U.S. Steel is on the market is because it needs investment.
Well, so U.S. Steel have themselves been saying, Yossi, they are actually concerned that they will have to reduce production without this takeover. And I think this is one of those to ask the question is to answer it thing. But obviously we can guess what Donald Trump was going to do or think or say about a proposed takeover of U.S. Steel by Nippon Steel. But also Vice President Harris has come out very strongly against it. She said U.S. Steel should remain American-owned and American-operated. Probably not coincidentally, she is endorsed by United Steelworkers and United Auto Workers. But is there anything going on here but just your basic nationalist pandering?
Trump probably will ask for a cut of the deal. But, on a serious note, when I did travel early this summer, it was to Japan. And I think actually talking about issues of nuclear disarmament, the pacifist movement there is still so strong. So to see Japan as a real threat to security, I think they just came with the wrong argument. There can be a good argument against these huge mergers. Because when they talk about efficiency and investment, and then we see actually jobs disappear. Instead of creating jobs. So when the trade unions are afraid, is because then come restructuring and then come, so-called efficiencies. And then some of the jobs, we saw it actually with steel in the UK, how in Wales thousands of jobs disappeared when it was sold to a foreign company. Now, this is the question. If we were in the world which is free market and everyone believes in capital, and there's a result of it. Those who have the money, those who can run companies more efficiently, they are the ones that will buy it. I think the question is whether, not the security issue, because Japan doesn't pose any security risk, whether the United States want to protect jobs in the United States and how it does it best, and when such companies are actually buying such huge conglomerate, how actually not only the jobs are secure, but also the conditions that workers are employed are secure. And this, I think, it's a genuine fear. of people that are employed. So I think the combination, yes, as you mentioned, the investment is needed. Otherwise, it won't be on the market. But how you protect workers?
I mean, that is a genuine fear, but I think the fear is the same for American companies. I mean, American companies have, if anything, an even worse track record in terms of closing U.S. firms and then moving factories to Mexico or to other countries where there's lower wages. So the foreign ownership issue, I think the issue you raise is a very important one in terms of job security, but the foreign ownership issue, I think, is not really the question there.
Yeah, but that's what needs to be put, not only in this case of a Japanese company, but generally within the economy, how secure. One of the reasons there is so much resentment in certain places that support Trump is exactly because of job security.
Well, in related news, we are to be treated later tonight to the second candidates' debate of this presidential campaign, though the first with this lineup. The first debate in Atlanta in June proved the beginning of the end of Joe Biden's campaign and indeed career, as he accomplished the remarkable feat of appearing actually less coherent than Donald Trump. Tonight's debate, like the aforementioned posturing over US steel, will occur in Philadelphia, the city from which one previous holder of the office to which Harris and Trump aspire, specifically John Adams, pointedly wrote that public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private virtue, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics. Adams was one of the framers of the US Constitution who did not anticipate that his fellow citizens would one day consider electing a convicted criminal. Patricia, as the representative American at this table, will you be staying up all night to watch this?
I will be staying up to watch.
You
yes,
are?
I will.
Out of professional obligation, or are you that much of a nerd? Actually, don't answer that. You're a big Lord of the Rings fan. That ship has sailed.
I am both, but also, it's almost like watching a terrifying thriller or horror movie, like where you want to close your eyes, and I'm afraid to watch in a way, which was certainly turned out to be the case during the first presidential election, the first debate between Biden and Trump. So I think I'll be watching, with kind of my fingers kind of half covering my eyes, afraid of how it will go.
Yossi, it would be fascinating to know what kind of conversations have been had within Vice President Harris's camp about how to approach this, because we know everything about Donald Trump. We know that he doesn't have any idea about policy or really about anything at all. We know that he is angry and belligerent and vindictive. We know that he is increasingly incapable of speaking the language, and we know that he is a convicted criminal. But if you're trying to debate against him and trying to win people over, is there any point in harping on the obvious, or do you have to find a new way round him?
The problem, we also know that last time 70 million people voted for him, and that's how you deal with that. I think it's how you deal with the bully in the playground. And I think more than the sequel to the Biden Trump, it's in a way the sequel to the Hillary Clinton. And how because the misogynism will come out because he can't help himself, and this will come out, and he will try to bully her. As long if she learned actually from the experience that Hillary Clinton went through and rise above this kind of bullying tactics and adhere to the topics. Those are the issues that American people care about. We talk about job security, childcare, and we saw the very elaborated answer by Trump about childcare that no one actually can understand when he was asked about it. And he went on all sorts of stories. Then he talks about stories about sharks and boats in his, which is incoherent, definitely in recent months. It's also changed the play game because all of a sudden he's not the young candidate anymore. And all of these issues play in favor for Kamala Harris. It's not to fall into the trap that he will do it by trying to bully her to places that when you have sometimes a fight and you are drawn into answer in a way that you don't want to begin with. And I'm sure that's part of what her advisor advisors are actually working with her.
Patricia, a thing that Vice President Harris shouldn't have to deal with, but does have to deal with because we live in the world as it is, not as it should be, is that the rules, or at least people judge female politicians by different standards to male ones. And there's plenty of footage, we've seen it, of Harris as an adversarial prosecutor type, chairing Senate committees, absolutely eating people for breakfast. But should she do that in this debate? Because it would be tempting, because she has a slow-moving target who knows absolutely nothing about policy, who would be very easy to skewer on detail and wind up and make angry. But I think this was what restrained Hillary Clinton in 2016, that you don't want to be written up as the shrill, angry, nagging woman, which isn't fair, but it's what it is.
I mean, I think it's a kind of an impossible situation, and which is why I kind of made the analogy to kind of watching a thriller and a horror film, because you don't know what's going to happen. I mean, everything Yossi that you said about the bullying, and you know what's coming, but that's the thing, how it's going to play out, it's very hard to say. And what sounds like a good, reasonable response sometimes resonates and sometimes it doesn't. And, it's look, if I used to be theater editor. You go to live theater, and one night you go and the audience is laughing at all the laugh lines and crying at all the points when there should be tears. And the next night you go, it's the exact same script, and the laugh lines go for duds, and people end up laughing at the tearjerker lines. I mean, it's very hard to predict, and that's what's so, I think, difficult for Harris, exactly for that reason, because a lot of the behavior, the responses that would be applauded if a man were to give them come out to be a negative for a woman.
Isn't it sort of a fine line between coming strong, knowing what, being strong on policies, solving things, at the same time not being patronizing towards him? Because if she patronizes...
I would love to see her patronize him. If I thought that was on the cards, I would absolutely stay up for that.
Not it's difficult to patronize someone like Donald Trump, and he deserves it. But I think if she patronizes him, it will come across that she patronizes some of his supporters.
I think
that's the fine line.
I think you're very right. And in fact, it's interesting. I mean, we're all armchair, kind of commentators, and I know nothing. So I just want to really preface that before I say anything. But I was even thinking that, when the vice president candidate Walz was talking about how weird Trump is, and all of that is true, but I think a lot of it gets interpreted by his supporters as a put down and filling into the resentment, which is exactly what has spurred support for Trump in the first place. And I think it's very important not to be patronizing for exactly that reason.
Well, for reasons possibly not unrelated to the looming presidential election, one sector of the US real estate market doing remarkably well is bunkers and shelters. It may do even better off the back of tonight's debate, given the apocalyptic rhetoric being traded by the candidates and their parties seeking to posit the election as the last off-ramp before Armageddon. And it's not like that there isn't. I was criticising somebody else for forgetting how to speak the English language not 3 minutes ago. And it is not like there isn't an audience for this stuff. According to one Pew poll in 2022, fully 39% of Americans believe we are living in end times. On the basis that they're bound to be right eventually, should we be laying in tinned goods in some fortified subterranean redoubt? Yossi, are you tempted? Would you, if you had the means, because this has become a massive thing with billionaires. Mark Zuckerberg is allegedly spending $270 million building some vast underground bunker. There are reports that another American billionaire has built a fortress with an inflammable moat, which I have to say I'm really keen on the idea of. That would be amazing. But if you had the wherewithal to construct something of the sort, would you?
So obviously there are some differences in gaps in means, what they can afford and what I can afford. Just an interesting point. Actually, in my neighborhood, there are still some gardens with bunkers from the Second World War.
The house next to mine in East London, when I moved in, did still have the Anderson shelter in the garden, yes.
So I think they can start advertising it, and prices will go up probably, and maybe you never know who is going to live in your neighborhood right now. No, I'm not. Just imagine what's the world if there will be left in the entire world like 100 or 1,000 billionaires. Do you really want to live with them?
Actually, it's sounding more and more appealing. To be honest. So there's only a few thousand people left, and I've got a castle with a moat full of petrol.
With what?
That sounds amazing.
Again, that's all the idea. If we mentioned nuclear, all the idea how you survive a nuclear apocalypse. It's exactly that. So few people will survive it. They have, one of the articles we saw earlier is about Costco selling all of these kits that you can survive for quite a while. Yes, I'm a member of Costco, so I have to profess here. But I haven't seen it, so it must be in the United States. But what it reminded me is actually what you get in the military when you're in the field, the kind of boxes. It's not very appealing.
I can report, unsurprisingly, that French field rations are actually not bad.
Well, you mentioned French.
Yeah, actually, not. I've had others which were not as good, but the French do all right. Patricia, responsible as we are holding you for the entire American people, what is it with your bunch and the apocalypse? Millions of your people believe that Armageddon is nigh. Terrible novels about the rapture sell by the absolute skipful. Is there some genuine sort of fascination with apocalypse at large in the American imagination, or is it, I wonder if it's also a relation of that peculiarly American thing of going on holiday and judging by the size of the motorhomes, taking literally everything you own with you?
Well, first of all, one of the questions I was going to ask, actually, do we know, in fact, that this is only American billionaires? Because, in fact, my guess would be, if I had to guess, that billionaires all over the world are building, the equivalent of bunkers with moats of fire around them.
Again, I'm just
but in terms of the U.S., I mean, it's interesting because, particularly when you watch these films or series from the 1950s and 60s, and the old Twilight Zone episodes is about the one family that has the bunker in the neighborhood and how it kind of turns into a Lord of the Flies when people think that there's the possibility of something happening, and how it tears apart the fabric. I mean, part of it, as you acknowledge, is religious. I mean, there is a religious belief, and that's very strong in American evangelism and such as you can find in other religions, I'm sure, and parts of it in the world. Just the U.S. is really big. I mean, I'm curious to what degree, going back to the nuclear threat, to what degree is there people who are, let's say, worried about climate?
There's a bit of that. Yeah.
Or also I would say the black helicopters, although I'm not sure everybody understands what that means. But, the idea that essentially, which I think are some Trump supporters, that the government is going to turn on its people and become a fascist state.
It's usually in that context pronounced government. We did research some relative budget options. You'll see there is a Texas company, surprise us, called Rising S, which will deliver bunkers. They cost about $49,000. That does not include the small ones. They start at $49,000. That does not include delivery and installation. But genuinely, it strikes me as less than you would pay in London for a loft. A loft. Yeah. And it's way cooler.
But what would you prefer, to have a loft or an extension, or have a bunker?
Well, why not both? I quite like the idea. I quite like the idea of the bunker. Also,
maybe you can install it in the loft-like space. And then,
I think an above-ground bunker significantly, especially one suspended a couple of floors above, significantly defeats the purpose.
Yes, but I actually was reading one of the articles that you're incredibly capable staff had sent about the bunkers. And some of them, apparently, a NASA scientist was talking about how they should be built above ground because water levels could rise.
Good point.
And therefore...
And then you've also got the watchtower option then as well.
Exactly.
Also, though, on the 26th of September, SDL Auctions here in the UK are auctioning a Royal Observer Corps bunker near Buxton. It's about 4 metres by 2 once you're underground. Guide price of about 15 to 20 grand. It's not portable, obviously. You would have to relocate to a hillock in Derbyshire.
That sounds like a grave.
Basically, yes. Though it could end up doubling as one, depending on how the apocalypse goes.
You know, you makes it less and less appealing.
Well, I mean, but I'm just saying, in terms of UK real estate, this is a steal. 15 to 20 grand. We just wanted to close finally. This is a sort of inverted, macabre desert island discs. Yossi, you first. What would you take with you to your bunker? So anything in particular you would want?
Wait, are you picking now musical selections?
Whatever you like.
Well, as long as I have a few of my books and my Apple Music, I'm all right.
Is Apple Music still going to work after the apocalypse?
You gave me a choice to take whatever I like.
That is true. Patricia, what would you be taking or decorating yours with?
The first thing I thought of was a really gigantic freezer with a lot of food in there.
But what about the electricity situation?
True. That could be.
You could take a generator.
How about a piano?
A piano.
Yes, because then I could learn how to play.
And that's one of the few places on earth you can play one without annoying the bejeebers out of your neighbours.
Exactly, there you go. Maybe even a drum kit in that case.
But is there really any point in learning the drums or the piano if you're not annoying the bejeebers out of your neighbours? I assume that's why people do it. Patricia Cohen and Yossi Meckelberg, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, we at Monocle are not alone in thinking that Vienna is one of the world's better cities. Our annual quality of life surveys have long highlighted Vienna's excellent housing, transport systems and its art scene. The latter has been a particular draw for frequent Monocle guest and renowned art writer Franchesca Gavin, who will be helming the artistic direction of the Vienna Contemporary Art Fair for its 10th anniversary. Bridging leading experimental and emerging artists from East and Central Europe, this year's fair will centre around the theme of energy, and it's set to run from September 12th to the 15th. Monocle's Gunnar Gronlid spoke to Franchesca earlier and began by asking her about her personal journey into the art world.
I studied art history, didn't expect to do anything with my degree, loved the subject, and when I came out I ended up going into book publishing for a while, for about a year and a half, doing picture research for book covers, and then I fell into Dazed and Confused. I'd bought 3 magazines to 5 magazines a week, every single week since I was 12. I said the one thing I didn't want to be was a journalist, and thus became one. I used to write about a variety of different things and went freelance pretty early in my career. But over time, it became clear to me that writing about contemporary art, I was just perfectly positioned to do, and it was the most interesting subject to me. And when I kind of fell into doing books and curation from there. So I've always described myself as a kind of journalistic curator. There's a lot of similarities between doing a book or a feature as doing an exhibition. It's just the form in which it manifests is different.
So transitioning into curation, that came fairly naturally, would you say?
100%. People would be like, you've written about this, would you like to do a show? And I'm the girl who says yes. So, it went really naturally for me. And I've done shows in such a variety of different levels, from private galleries to co-curating Manifesta in Zurich in 2016 to things in institutions like Somerset House or the Fundação Serralves in Porto, to project spaces. I like the breadth, but I'm very embedded in the art world.
And was the transition into doing a fair like the Vienna Contemporary, did that also come equally naturally? And
Yeah.
is it very different to do a fair like this compared to a normal curated gallery or exhibition?
That's really interesting. Well, I think the great thing that I had is a breadth of relationships with galleries. I think if I'd gone in-house at one gallery, that would have been more of a different situation because it limits you somehow. But I was in an amazing position where I had already fallen in love with Vienna as a place, spent the pandemic there. I'd already been the walking Vienna tourist board explaining why the art scene there is so exciting. So falling into the role was something I'd almost been doing already. It was just a kind of formalization of my enthusiasm from what's coming out of Austria.
Yeah, so now with your first fair coming up in September, what's sort of your specific mission? What are you trying to do with this year's edition?
I mean, it's the 10th anniversary and we're growing the fair quite a lot compared to the past few years where it shrunk a little over the pandemic into a much smaller location. We've got a new location, larger booth spaces, growing the program. I'm really proud of the list of galleries that are coming. Some incredible ones from Milan and Poland, and as well as all the top galleries within Austria itself. So my aim is to bring awareness, which I think has really happened. I think people are conscious of Austrian galleries appearing at fairs around the world, but I really wanted to highlight how much that region is exciting from a more kind of international perspective. So really, raise awareness of why it's so great out there, bring collectors to make them enthusiastic about coming. And I think there's so much opportunity for September to be the moment when people come to Vienna to discover art that you wouldn't necessarily see at other fairs.
Yeah, no, I read you say that you want to make Vienna the sort of new European hub for contemporary art. What is it about Vienna that makes it such a good place for this?
That's really interesting. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Berlin since 2007, let's say. I spent about 10 years back and forth from there, and I was very conscious that that emerged because Berlin was an artist city, and now artists can't afford to live there. The gentrification has been so dramatic in Berlin, and Vienna truly is the last capital, I think, within Europe, which has a high level of galleries, but also really more project spaces than any other city in Europe, incredible museums, all a 10-minute walk from each other, and 2 incredibly good art schools with really great talent coming out of there. So for me, I became conscious of the uniqueness of the city, but then also the wider uniqueness of Vienna as this wildly southern, eastern location that really does historically bridge the East to Central Europe.
Yeah.
And I think collectors and curators are always looking for new work, different kinds of visual experimentation. And I was just very excited by what came out of there. And I think, so for me, I think Vienna was just like, it's almost got all the elements to blow off. It's just about getting the right combination to make it happen.
Right. Well, speaking of sort of finding the right combination, and you mentioned curators and collectors there, how do you sort of balance designing a fair like this in terms of giving collectors what they're looking for, but also the general public, and getting people who maybe don't know the contemporary art world very well, who aren't so familiar with it, interested in sort of digging into it?
There's definitely a kind of exhibition part, a kind of experiential element to the fair that takes place there. We have this show called Statement, which has always been kind of politically connected, with a couple of talks that are connected to that. The first year was about the Ukraine. The second was about migration. This year we're looking at energy. So it's done with Marilla Baciek, who's the curator of the Salzburger Kunstverein. So the first half of the exhibition opens at the fair. The week later, it opens in Salzburg. So I found that really fascinating to have that kind of experiential nature of art, but also there are 2 sections that are solo booths, one of emerging artists and one of late 20th century artists, that I think, again, is a really accessible way for the wider public to come and experience and discover work. I've always been into transgenerational comparisons. I think it's really interesting to see what makes art so exciting is how it comes out of the past or redevelops those conversations. But also, I'm here as a fair director, essentially, to also be supporting the businesses and the galleries and to be showcasing them. I mean, the galleries decide what work they're bringing. Obviously, we have a gallery committee, which is made of incredible gallerists, to discuss their applications. So it's very much about how can we showcase what they're doing as much as possible. So it's not full curation in that say, it's a different kind of process.
Yeah, and in terms of how then you're speaking about sort of transgenerational, and there's one aspect which is the new generation coming into the art world and making new kinds of art, but there's also the younger generations trying to engage with art. And I feel like a unique challenge maybe now with the younger generations is that obviously we're flooded so much with sort of highly emotional, intense imagery on social media and so on that can be political, cultural, entertainment. I wonder, do you find that young people now, do you think it's more difficult for them to engage with art?
I think that's really interesting. I actually think that the opportunities of, let's say, social media and the internet have actually broadened and expanded in interest in visual culture. I think we have more people feeling able to enter the art world than before, particularly from younger generations, because they have it in the intimacy of the object that sits in their pocket and they look at every day. And maybe we don't need to live in a world where the differentiations between high and low, what's entertainment and what's high art, art, the slowness, the fastness. I don't necessarily believe you have to separate those things.
Yeah.
I'm really interested in work that fuses everything. And I think something about a fair, in a way that some galleries maybe put people off, like going to like a luxury store. Not everyone feels comfortable doing that. There's something about the fair context, closer to a supermarket, essentially. It's a booth trade fair that can bring people in to basically have a sense of discovery. I also think in particular in Vienna, it's a bit slower out there. It's a little bit, there's space, there's time for people to study. It's not necessarily, it's kind of a different quality of life. Obviously, Monocle in particular has made Vienna the city to live in beyond anywhere, numerous years. And that quality of life, I think, really impacts also how people engage with culture out there. It's kind of normalized and very much part of people's curiosity. But I think that social media can overwhelm us, but maybe seeing something in life is actually the perfect antidote to that.
Franchesca Gavin speaking to Monocle's Gunnar Grunlid, and the Vienna Contemporary Art Fair starts later this week on the 12th. Which is Thursday, to be precise. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Yossi Meckelberg and Patricia Cohen. Today's show was produced by Anita Riotta and researched by Gunnar Grunlid and Sana Germani. Our sound engineer was Lily Austin. Don't forget to subscribe to Monocle's free daily email bulletins at monocle.com. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily returns at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
"2024 is a pivotal year for global politics. Meanwhile, conflict, climate change, and AI dominate the headlines. What do these global stories mean for you? The Financial Times offers fearless thinking in defining moments. Its trusted journalists deliver impartial analysis on the world's biggest news events, helping you to form your own bold opinions. Start reading the Financial Times at ft.com.